Politics in the Soul, Reading the City of God. Augustine seems to have been the last to know at least what it once meant to be a citizen. Hannah Arendt's judgment is all the more interesting because she clearly considered Augustine to be the single thinker most responsible for the Christian repudiation of the public realm. A repudiation which she regarded as, in its modern guise, one of the major threats to the security, peace, and sanity of the human world. The public realm is seen by Arendt as the world we consciously have in common. To paraphrase her rather condensed exposition, we could say that the common world is what provides us with an identity in terms of language. It's the possibility of securing what I have been and done and said as an individual by locating it in a tradition of speech and recollection. It is what makes it possible for me to be remembered, for me to be part of the conversation of a future generation. Thus, it is a sign of a common humanity. Existing independently of my will or imagination, to engage in public life is to accept that I'm finite and time-bound, born into a continuum of language and interaction I did not choose or invent. I did also to transcend my finitude in the only way I can, by striving to contribute to the language and interaction of the group, some new qualification or nuance that can reasonably and properly become part of a tradition, a heritage. Our goal should be to make our lives a symbol perfected in death. That's from T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding. Without this, we're doomed to the futile insignificance of purely private and individual life, futile insofar as its value is perceptible only to my subjectivity and the subjectivities of those I'm in immediate contact with, and because its conduct is likely to be constrained and dominated by my need to survive and meet my necessities and those of my dependents. In this sense, says Arendt, classical thought considered the public realm to be the sphere of true freedom. Rule, coercive power, even violence belong in the household, since they're the means of mastering necessity, organizing the threatening, incipient chaos of daily life. Without the patterns of dominance securely fixed in the domestic order, no one would be able to go out into the polis among equals, freed from private need, so as to engage in the creative, intelligible work of constructing shared meanings and shared futures. In action worthy of remembrance, action establishing a human continuity that transcends the immediate and the local. The private has no history because the struggle for survival and the meeting of needs has no history. And without this public realm of active, creative persons taking responsibility for the integrity and continuation of a form of talking and understanding, we are condemned either to the animal pointlessness of the mere effort to subsist, or to the more typically modern unfreedom of mass society, in which financial achievement and reward or security replaces glory and repute. The notion of worthiness to be remembered and the quality of public action as creative, as formative, of a conversation extending beyond individual death is undermined. Society becomes increasingly incapable of intelligent speech, common imagination, increasingly enslaved to idolatrous objectifications, fetishes, and slogans. How then does Christianity, or Augustinian Christianity in particular, carry forward this subversion of the public? The early church, Arendt suggests, is a community of people more or less marginalized by their refusal of Roman imperial authority and their anticipation of the end of the world. Humanly speaking, the conversation is simply not going to continue. What then can replace the world as a bond between such persons? The sense of belonging to a community, which is in important respects more like a kindred, a family, than a polis, in which achievement, excellence, or creativity are irrelevant to membership, even damaging. It is a body held together by love, caritas, the bond of charity between people. While it is incapable of founding a public realm of its own, is admirably fit to carry a group of essentially wordless people through the world. Caritas is, in the Augustinian system, a love which is indifferent to merit and achievement. It sees the bonds between persons and resting simply on their common createdness and equal sinfulness, and thus operates impartially and, in a sense, impersonally. In her doctoral thesis of 1929, Dorlebus Begriff bei Augustine, Arendt had argued that caritas means loving the eternal in ourselves and others, and that this is the essence of Christian neighborly love. We see in one another tokens of both the creative and the redemptive work of God. As creatures, we love still at a distance, we coexist, but as sinful objects of the saving work of Christ, we're brought together in communion. A non-worldly society is thus created, the city of God. By the time she came to write The Human Condition in the 1950s, Arendt was far more openly hostile to the idea of non-worldly community than she'd been in 1929. That, as she would no doubt have told you, is that what the 20th century does to you. But the analysis of Augustine and the principle of worldless love means much the same. The civitas Dei is a substitute for the public realm, and thus its enemy. Yet Augustine knew at least what it once meant to be a citizen. That is a remark made in passing, puzzling in the light of the conclusion that it's Augustine who makes it more or less impossible for a Christian to be a citizen. In this paper, I want to explore precisely why Augustine might be said to understand what is involved in citizenship, and how far he may, at the same time, be rightly seen as a subverter of the values of the classical public and political realm. Hannah Arendt is, I believe, right, though not perhaps for the right reasons. And on the other hand, a recent defense of Augustine as a fundamentally political agitator, Peter Bathory's Political Theory as Public Confession, seeks to correct the imbalance that prompts the notion that Augustine commended passivity or disengagement, yet does so at the expense of any analysis of the saint's radical assault on the conventionally political as such. Both Arendt and Bathory, in fact, seem to resolve what many readers of Augustine have found to be an irresolvable set of tensions. As will appear, I do not believe Augustine is guilty simply of flat contradictions, but I see little value in trying to extract a wholly consistent program from the city of God. We should look less for a systematic account of church and world, let alone church and state, more for a scheme for reflecting on the nature of social virtue. Robert Marcus, in what remains probably the finest survey of Augustine's political thinking in English, argues for a tendency in De Civitate to atomistic personalism, where Augustine is reflecting on what we should call state power. Augustine may write of a civitas terrena, yet his discussion deals not with anything that could be called an institution, but rather with persons and processes. Thus, we can't really say that he has a theory of the state at all, even in the attenuated sense discussed by Figgis, who is careful to warn against the translation of civitas by any strictly political term. Augustine does not think, or at least does not consistently think, of two distinct kinds of human association, the sacred and the secular, or even the private and the public. His concern is with the goal of human life as such. Thus, at the end of Book 18 of the De Civitate, we read that both cities of God and of this world experience the same vicissitudes of earthly life and make use of the same temporal goods, but diverse fide, diverse spe, diverso amore. Their goals are distinct, and so will be their eternal rewards. Book 19 then opens the discussion of the end of human existence, meaning the goal of human existence. And the political debate of this book must be read in that light. Augustine is not here seeking to pronounce on what might be an appropriate relationship between the two cities. He's just completed a fairly full account of the history of persecution and concluded firmly that there can be no guarantee of persecution ever being a thing of the past. The last thing he's likely to wish to do is to draft a concordat between the city of God and its avowed enemies. His question in Book 19 is rather about the optimal form of corporate human life in the light of what is understood to be its last end. At this level, the De Civitate is not at all a work of political theory in the usual sense, but sketches for a theological anthropology and a corporate spirituality. The political and the spiritual are not separate concerns. Book 19 seeks to show that the spiritual is the authentically political. Although it is in one sense quite true to say with Marcus that Augustine abandons the classical idea of creative politics, of life in the empirical city as a sphere of the pre-development of moral persons towards the human goal, this does not mean that the state repudiates the public realm for something else, or even that his perspective is atomistic in quite Marcus's sense. Rather, he's engaged in a redefinition of the public itself, designed to show that it is life outside the Christian community which fails to be truly public, authentically political. The opposition is not between public and private, church and world, but between political virtue and political vice. At the end of the day, it is the secular order that will be shown to be atomistic in its foundations. In both books 12 and 19, Augustine refers us to Cicero's De Republica for a definition of the public realm or the commonwealth, as Healy accurately renders it. A populace is not just any contingent gathering of persons, but a group bound together, juris consensu et utilitatis communioni. This, then, is where discussion of the properly political, consciously and articulately shared life must begin. An agreement over what are and are not legitimate moves within the social grouping, and in some sort of guaranteed common access to the things that sustain life, not too far from access to the means of production, perhaps. There are worse translations of utilitas. In a celebrated polemical section, Augustine demolishes the claims of pagan Rome to being a commonwealth, on the grounds of what seems to be a piece of lexical sleight of hand. Use gives to each his or her due, but pagan society cannot give God his due. It offers sacrifices to demons. Only the Christian community offers sacrifices to the true God, and what is more, the only acceptable sacrifice itself as a totality redeemed in Christ. This is not, however, quite as disingenuous as it sounds. A social practice which impedes human beings from offering themselves to God, in fact, denies that central impulse in human nature, which Augustine defined as the unquenchable desire for God and his truth. It provides earthsat's gratifications, finite substitutes for the infinite, and as such diminishes humanity itself, in that it takes away the one principle that can rightly order our wills and affections. Quando quidem Deum non serviens, nullo modo potest iuste, animus corpori aut humina ratio vitiis imperare. There are indeed other factors which may regulate the passions, but to suppose it virtue resulting from this kind of control is really vice, pride, and vainglory, and so far as it's not referred to God. So beate vivere is made impossible for us when society directs us to goals other than the glory of our Maker. Thus, if the pagan republica is deficient as a commonwealth, It is not because Augustine polemically sets a standard of unattainably high righteousness or religious probity, but because a society incapable of giving God his due fails to give its citizens their due, as human beings made for the quest and the enjoyment of God. Where there is no use towards God, there is no common sense of what is due to human beings, no iuris consensus. And this theme proves to be the main burden of the De Civitate's vision of political virtue. If this reading of Book 19, chapters 21 through 23 is correct, then the argument about true and false commonwealths cannot be resolved by appealing to Augustine's allegedly more pragmatic definition of the res publica in Book 1924. Normally, this has been seen as indicating that Augustine has exhausted his polemic. This here means the definition offered in chapter 24. And is now attempting to work a more constructive vein. The definition of a populace is united by use has been shown to be inapplicable to any but the people of God. Is the Roman Republic then no more than an arbitrary quotas? No, for there are other possible definitions. Let us try one. We might define the Commonwealth as unified rerum quos diligit concordi communione, by harmony as regards the things it loves or values. On this showing, of course, there is a sense in which Rome counts as a commonwealth. So would any empirical political unit. We may as well say state from now on, misleading as a term is in many respects, and I want to emphasize that it's very misleading. But what is often missed in this chapter is the note of irony. In the catalogue of nations thus admitted under the definition of a res publica, Athens begins the list and Babylon ends it. There's a continuum between the ideal of classical politics and its antithesis, the tyrannies of the Orient, for without God's justice, the one is merely on the way to becoming the other. Justitiate veritas is by no means secured by this putative harmony about values. In this chapter, Augustine recalls the arguments of earlier books to the effect that while Rome may once have been, in principle, committed to a genuinely common harmony, it has long since become an empty word. A state may claim to possess the necessary concord as regards the objects of its delectio, that means its delight or its love. But what degree of stability can such a society possess? It is doomed to vice, Book 19, chapter 25, and its security is transitory, Book 19, chapter 26. In short, while it may be empirically an unintelligibly unified body, it is constantly undermining its own communal character, since its common goals are not and cannot be those abiding values which answer to the truest human needs. So far from Book 19, chapter 24, representing a shift in Augustine's analysis towards a more pragmatic and positive view of the state, it is in its context a final stage in the argument begun in 1921. Take even the most minimal and trivial definition of a political body, the unity of common aims, so that you include tyrannies as well as the classical polis, and you will still have a picture of societies that cannot cohere, that are their own worst enemies, condemning themselves to abiding in security. We may call them commonwealths if we will, since there's no doubt that they exist as identifiable social units. But their character and structure are inimical to the very nature of an ordered unity in plurality, a genuine res publica. To understand this more fully, we must refer back to the earlier books of the City of God, the more directly formed by controversial interest. Book 2, chapter 21, in its summary of the argument attributed in Cicero's De Republica to Scipio lays great stress on justice and harmony as the conditions of unity in the state. The various orders of society collaborate rationally, each contributing its own particular note to the harmony. This, of course, assumes that the function of each person or rank in the civitas is uncontroversial. And if any class or functionary acquires disproportionate power, injustice is created and the res publica therewith ceases to exist. Thus, all members of a society must know their place in a universal order. They must know how to live in accord with natural law. But Book 2 argues, how are they to know this? Chapters 4 to 7, 14 to 16, and 22 to 26 in particular demonstrate that neither the pagan gods nor the antique philosophers, for all their achievements, enable citizens to live well in accord with the lex aeterna. A poet like Perseus may exhort men and women to learn ordo, the bounds of aspiration, the will of God, but he writes as a private individual. Such are not the values celebrated in the public worship and festival of antiquity. How then are such values to be established as the common human heritage? The classical world is thus shown to be without any authentic conception of public virtue. Book 5 takes this still further in its treatment of the motivation of virtue in Roman society. We've noted that in Book 19, Chapter 25, it's admitted that virtue of a sort is possible where vice is restrained for motives other than the fear of God. That brief aside is meant to recall the bleak reductionism of 5, chapters 12 through 20. The longing for public praise, for glory, for good name, controls that libido dominandi which so ruins the unity of any state. In this way, under the providence of God, a spacious unity is given to the existing order, even a measure of stability. A small number of persons taking a leading role in the state, obsessed with their desire for glory, are enabled, one would almost think supernaturally, to resist the greater power of other nations. The remarkable success of the early Roman Republic are not due to the favor of the Roman gods. We've already seen in books 2 and 3 that they show little sign of being concerned for the welfare of their worshippers, nor simply to eminent causes like the extraordinary power of disinterested virtue. Augustine's explanation is at once cynical and theological. The lust for glory restrains the more obvious factors making for disintegration in the state, and God elects to raise up a new empire over against the ancient tyrannies of the East, one which at least represents some kind of judgment upon the unbridled libido dominandi of these older systems. And here he's thinking of Carthage. Yet the Roman polity is still vacuous at its core. Cicero recommends that the ruler of a city should be educated in the longing for glory. Thus, the rebellious impulses to tyranny, prodigality, or whatever are governed and ordered by one supreme sin, pride. This means that the classical republic is shut out from ordo and lex aeterna. It is built on disorder, and that what should restrain passion is itself replaced by a passion. That sovereignty of spiritual over material interest, which is the essence of ordo, is parodied by the elevation to supreme status of a material or worldly interest capable of masquerading as spiritual. But this is not the only problem about a glory-dominated public ethic. Glory is of its very nature an individual matter, won by competition and not open to all. Augustine mentions, without stressing it, in Book 5, Chapter 12, that the classic Roman story is of the achievements and virtues of the few. And while this is in the context part of a testimony to the striking nature of their public's triumphs, it's also made clear that the majority of the population, politically inactive, are kept united only by fear of external enemies. The desire for glory is not a universal moral instructor or preserver of social order. It can assist the unity of a society only negatively, as we've seen by restraining tyranny. And in Book 15, Augustine still has harsher things to say. Romulus and Remus are alike prompted by the desire for glory in their work in founding the Roman state, but glory is not easily shared. Qui enim volebat dominando gloriare, minus utique dominaretur, si eius potestas vivo consorte minuiretur. Preoccupation with achievement brings in its wake a preoccupation with power and with preeminence. The whole point of the quest for glory lies in the urge to gain advantage over another. In contrast, the love and longing for goodness which marks the city of God is of its essence a desire which seeks to share its object, tanto eam reperet ampliorum quanto amplius ibi potueret amare consortum. More is gained by the love of those others who share the quest and the goal. But the search for glory means that the civitas terrena is torn by constant strife, the very thing which can in certain circumstances save a society from total dissolution is also potentially a murderous and divisive force. The conclusion is clear enough. Classical society and classical political thought provide ideals for the corporate life of humanity which they can't provide the means to realize. Already in the Confessions, Augustine had had much to say about those, in this case the Platonists, who offered the possibility of vision without transformation. Here, in De Civitate, the same complaint can be heard. It's all very well to talk about the public realm, about justice, about commonality, Augustine says, but empirically speaking, the means employed to make a quotas of persons more than a chance aggregate consistently subvert true common life. It does not greatly matter whether or not we decide to accord the name of res publica to this or that political order. The reality of common or public life isn't there. Unity will always be something imposed from outside rather than growing from within, and so it comes about that states need enemies. As Augustine observes in Book 1, Carthage played a highly significant role in securing order and justice in Rome. The destruction of the Republic's great rival meant that the libido dominandi, hitherto checked by the need for discipline and unity, and to some extent exercised in defense against an external aggressor, came to be exercised within the state, producing gross inequality and injustice. Aggression not dealt with in the inner ecology of social beings seeks outlets, if not against a stranger, then by making strangers of fellow citizens. Fear, hatred, and the struggle to survive become characteristics of relations between those orders of society which for Augustine, as for Cicero, ought to live in interdependent harmony. But such a vision of interdependence is empty without the undergirding of a vision of humanity in the purposes of its maker. This interdependence and the critique of internal social aggression must not be misconstrued. It's nothing to do, as a modern liberal might hope, and liberal here is small l liberal, meaning like liberal liberty, with collaboration and exchange between equals.